Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. September 26, 1918. A wet, muddy day in the Meuse-Argonne forest of western France. American tanks clatter ahead, firing their cannons and machine guns, rolling inexorably towards the town of Cheppy. At the front of the formation walks the unit's commander, a tall, strapping colonel. He has taken it upon himself to create, train, and equip the newly formed tank corps of the American Expeditionary Force. And now he is personally leading them into battle against the Germans. He aims his ivory-handled .45 and fires at the enemy trench line, as round after round from their rifles and machine guns ping against the hulls of the American armored vehicles. Colonel George S. Patton grits his teeth, reloads his weapon, and orders his troops to charge ahead. Hello, and welcome back to Badass of the Week. My name is Ben Thompson, and I am here, as always, with my co-host, Dr. Pat Larish. Pat, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and shout out to all our listeners. Hi, listeners.
Yes. Yeah, we have a lot of new people. I see that some people have been liking and some new subscribers. We really appreciate it. It really helps the show out. We want to keep making these, and without your support, we can't keep doing it. So if you're a fan of the show, please do give us a comment, send us an email. You can send us a message on Twitter. We're at Badass of the Week. And yeah, all of this stuff really helps us. Please share it with a friend who you think might like it. Download a show, check it out. The more listeners we can get for the show, the more likely we are to be able to continue doing this in the future, which would be really great. And we hope that is able to happen, because we have a lot of badasses that we need to talk about in the future, and it would be nice to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So speaking of badass, Pat, I heard that you were going to do Barbenheimer. I think the last time we talked, you'd mentioned possibly doing that.
Possibly doing Barbenheimer. Well, I'm getting together with some friends at work, and we're going to do half of Barbenheimer, because I don't think I could handle sitting in a movie theater for 2 feature-length films, now that I think about it.
Especially since one of them is I think something in the over 3 hours range. I think this is it's like a full-time job to watch both these movies in a day.
Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with long movies. It's just they're long, and you have to manage your expectations.
Yeah. It's just, that's your day, right? And you should be reading about badasses to research for our show, and instead you're going to be sitting in the movie theater.
Yes.
Although my wife does love Richard Feynman. She thinks that she's like, if there were any people I would ever consider leaving you for, it would be Tony Stark, assuming he was completely real, or Richard Feynman. I mean, it's just because she's an engineer and she likes engineering stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't know if he's a badass or not, but I don't want to write about him because of that sentence, because she said that.
Yeah. Well, Tony Stark is fictional and Richard Feynman is dead, so I think you're okay.
Yeah, and Richard Feynman was also kind of famously a huge asshole in real life.
Unfortunately, some badasses were also assholes.
Yeah, you don't want to meet your heroes.
Should we call them badassholes?
Maybe. Yeah, you never want to meet your heroes, right? Everybody's just people in there.
No, you never do. You also don't want to meet your enemies.
No, that's true. That's very true. But yeah, even some people who we have this ideal of them in our heads, or we love them in movies, or we love them on TV, or we like the idea of them. You don't really want to let them babysit your kids,
No.
Speaking of which, Pat, have you seen the Patton movie?
I don't think I have. No, you have though.
I have seen Patton. My funny story about the Patton movie is I have a friend who is a musician, and he used to play on the Warp Tour. He was doing, which is a traveling punk rock festival. I don't know if they still do it. I went to several of them when I was in high school and college. He, I guess, had been playing some show, and this was, I don't know, in the late 2000s. He was playing a show, and at some point during the show, he'd fallen off the stage and hurt himself, or at some point had injured himself, or was, I don't know, for whatever reason, he ended up in the medical tent, and he missed his ride to the next stop on the Warp Tour. So he went out into the talent parking lot and was just trying to flag anybody down to get a ride to the next stop. And he gets picked up by this like really nice tour bus, and it's the band Rancid. They did Time Bomb and Ruby Soho. They're like a pretty well-known punk rock band from the 90s. They're still doing songs now, but like their big hits were from the 90s. And he gets picked up by them, and he's like, dude, it's Rancid. Like, they're awesome. I love them. I grew up listening to them. This is going to be great. Like, they're going to be total party animals. These guys have these giant like 2-foot like mohawks and stuff, and they're kind of punk rock icons.
Yeah.
And so he gets in the car and he's like, we're going to party. And it turns out that the entire band was all getting sober at the same time. So there was no drinking and no partying.
Ooh.
And all they did was watch Patton on repeat for like the entire drive to the next tour destination.
Oh, wow.
And he was like, I like the movie, but I watching it 3 times in a row, it was kind of a lot.
Yeah. Is this like the grown-up version of putting your toddler's favorite episode of Paw Patrol on repeat?
It is a lot like that. Yeah, it's just like listening to Baby Shark 75 times in a row.
Yeah, okay.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I will say that Patton is very good. The 1970 movie, it won just like ridiculous number of awards.
Yeah.
I mean, it's worth a watch if you like war movies. It is what you think it is when going into it. It's a war biopic, and there's problems with it that are not really worth mentioning. Like, all of the German tanks are just U.S. tanks from the 1970s. It's actually really funny because all of the German tanks, they're supposed to be Tiger I tanks, but there's very few Tiger I tanks left in existence, and they couldn't CG them in. So they took M60 Patton tanks, which are literally named after George Patton, and they painted them in German colors and put a German cross on them. And they're like, these are the German tanks. And it's really funny because, it's the Patton tank and Patton's fighting them, and they're painted up like tigers.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, the movie, it was Francis Ford Coppola wrote the screenplay. George C. Scott's in it. It won like so many Academy Awards: Best Picture, Director, Best Actor, Original Screenplay, Art Direction, Film Editing, Sound. And that's all just the Academy Awards. It's one of those ones that's just like probably has its own Wikipedia entry of like list of awards won by this movie.
Yeah. And even if you haven't seen the movie itself, Patton's epic speech at the beginning has kind of taken on a life of its own.
That's true. But also, we're going to get into it on this episode. But one thing about that Patton speech is that they toned it down for the movie, because he swears a lot in it. And they say swear like a sailor, but Patton could swear with the best of them. So it got toned down a little bit for the movie. I'll give you an example, because this is a Patton quote that I like. I'm not going to attempt to do it in the style of George C. Scott, like Academy Award-winning actor George C. Scott.
No one can do that. Only George C. Scott can do George C. Scott.
Right. And I don't have the presence of a military commander. I am just some guy recording in a closet. Okay, here's the quote, and I'll do my best to not impersonate George C. Scott with it. We're not just going to shoot the sons of bitches. We're going to rip out their living goddamn guts and use them to grease the treads of our tanks. We're going to murder those lousy Hun bastards by the bushel fucking basket. War is a bloody killing business. You've got to spill their blood or they will spill yours.
Bravo, bravo. Sounds like you're just explaining your to-do list.
Yeah, it's like a bad cover song of like an awesome song that you like.
Yep.
But if I try to do it more accurately, like it's like covering the Beatles, right? I'm never going to improve upon the George C. Scott version of this, but I will just adapt it in my own style of mild-mannered podcaster dude. Anyway,
so
we are going to talk about Patton, and we are going to get to it right after this break. George Smith Patton was born November 11th, 1885 in San Gabriel, California. As a young kid, he loved classics. He loved reading. Woo. Yeah, he liked reading old Greek and Roman war stories. He liked all kinds of military history.
There are many war stories in Greek and Roman sources, yes?
Yes, but he was generally focused on
that's not what he's known for.
Yes, he was probably reading about Caesar and Hannibal more than he was reading...
love poetry.
Yeah, exactly. His great uncles, he had 6 of them. They were all Confederate officers in the Civil War. He's from this military family on both sides. And he kind of knew pretty early on that that's what he wanted to do. He went to high school in Pasadena. He attended the Virginia Military Academy. And then from there, he went to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He graduated in 1909, was commissioned as second lieutenant in the U.S. Cavalry, which was still a thing that was relevant in 1909. And not long after that, he gets married to his wife, Beatrice, he stays married to for the rest of his life, which is kind of cool. Now, we don't know how or why he was selected. There's not good data on this, or nobody wrote it down. I don't know why. But he ended up, he graduated in 1909, and in 1912, he was selected to represent the United States in the Stockholm Olympics in a new event that they had just created called the Modern Pentathlon, which, Pat, is based off, which is like a modern interpretation of the ancient Greek one, right?
Yeah. And the ancient Greek pentathlon, and Patton might very well have known this since he was a student of the classics. As the pentathlon was done in the original Olympics, you had to perform in all of the things that you needed to be a superb Greek soldier. So the long jump, the javelin throw, the discus throw, the stadium foot race, and wrestling. Now, that's what it took to be a soldier back then. But in 1912, what do you need to be a good soldier in 1912? It seems like discus throwing doesn't seem as relevant for modern warfare.
Not so much. So in 1912, the modern pentathlon, the things that it takes to be a good soldier in the world in 1912, they decided was fencing, shooting, horseback riding, swimming, and running. Seems pretty legit.
Yeah, what type of running? Are we talking sprint or?
Long distance, 4,000 meter cross country.
Cool.
Yeah. And so, it was épée fencing, pistol shooting, riding, equestrian events, swimming, and a 4,000 meter cross country running. So George S. Patton competes in this in 1912. He's a participant in the first ever modern pentathlon Olympic event. He finishes 5th out of 32 competitors behind 4 guys from Sweden, which I don't know.
Yeah.
Sweden swept the medals, the Stockholm Olympics in this event.
Yeah.
Weirdly, the thing that hurt Patton in his finish was that he finished 20th in shooting, which you'd think he'd have been better at that because he's kind of famous for waving around those ivory-handled pistols that he used to carry.
Yes.
So there's a little debate on this. So the judges ruled that he missed on his final shot. His argument was that he didn't miss. It just went through an existing bullet hole, kind of like the Robin Hood splitting the arrow thing.
Yeah.
He just perfectly shot the same bullet hole twice. And one thing that leads a little credence is that he was using a larger caliber handgun than anybody else was. Everybody else showed up with their 22 target pistols, 22 caliber target pistols. And he showed up with his Service 38, which is 16 millimeters wider than the 22. And so he was saying, it was, the hole's a little bigger and this one went right through and that's why he didn't see it. The judges didn't agree and he finished 5th.
Okay.
So that's that.
Yeah.
So he comes in 5th. He doesn't get a medal, but he does represent the U.S. in this event. After that, he returns to the Army, and they send him to France in 1913 to study with the French Master at Arms, this guy named Charles Cléry, at their cavalry school. He learns to speak French fluently, better than I am speaking it currently. And he learns the French sword fighting style, which is very different than the German and up until this point, the American sword fighting style. The Germans preferred to slash with the sword, but the French like to stab with it. Think of those long, skinny rapiers that that we see across the board on, the musketeers and things like that. And so the French...
En garde.
Yeah, en garde. The French doctrine was that with the advent of armor, you were going to have to stab at weak points. It was the only way to get under the armor.
Yeah.
Whereas the Germans just wanted to brute force you down, brute force through it. So he learns the French style of fighting, and then he comes back to the U.S. He's set up at the Mounted Service School. It's a cavalry school in Fort Riley, Kansas. And he is certified as the Army's first Master of the Sword, which just sounds like...
Whoa.
Yeah, it sounds like He-Man, right? It sounds like, I have the power.
Yeah. And it seems odd to me that this is the first time the Army has had a Master of the Sword. Swords have been around for a long time.
Yeah, I guess the U.S. Army isn't traditionally known for its sword fighting.
Okay, yeah, true.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know why this is just randomly where we started with it, but But Patton goes over in 1913, learns from the French master, who was at the time deemed to be like the greatest military swordsman alive. And he comes back and starts teaching sword fighting to the U.S. Army. He writes a couple books about it, various books about sword fighting, and he helps design the next generation of cavalry saber.
Ooh.
Yeah. He is part of the team that designs the model 1913 Army cavalry saber, which today we call the Patton saber.
Okay. So yet another thing named after him.
Yes. It will be the first of many things that will be named after him. The Patton saber is a little, because he'd been learning the stabbing technique, it's a little more stabby than it's a cavalry saber. And most cavalry sabers are big and heavy and curved, but he wanted one that was a little more stabby, a little more rapier-like, because he had been learning that style of fighting. The Army produced 20,000 of these weapons, and they went into production in 1914, the same year that World War I began.
Yes.
And they, didn't see a lot of action because suddenly swords are not that useful anymore.
Yeah.
Patton actually got selected to represent the United States in the 1916 Modern Pentathlon, but those games ended up being canceled due to the war.
Yeah.
So Patton and the U.S. didn't join the war immediately, though. The World War I starts in 1914, and the U.S. kind of stays out of it for the first 3 years of the fighting over there. Patton's kind of itching to get into battle. He's a guy who wants to fight. He first gets his chance in 1916 when the town of Columbus, New Mexico, was attacked by soldiers under the command of Mexican General Pancho Villa.
Yeah, and this was an attention-getting move. Villa wanted to poke the bear, basically. He wanted to get the U.S. to invade Mexico. So what do? You attack Columbus, New Mexico.
Yeah. They were having a civil war in Mexico, and Villa had been at the forefront of it, and he was winning, and then he was losing, and then the U.S. backed the other guy.
Yeah.
And Villa was upset about it because Villa actually controlled more territory than the other guy did, and he was just kind of trying to provoke trouble.
Yes.
And he got it. I mean, the U.S. put together a force to go down there. They went down there to try to attack him.
And the force included Patton.
The force did include Patton. It wasn't originally supposed to. So he had to volunteer. He went to General John Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, who was the American general in charge of the expedition, and was like, hey, what can I do? How can I get involved with this? How can I be part of this? And so Pershing took him on as a personal aide and a courier. Pershing actually at some point was engaged to Patton's sister.
Oh, wow. Small world.
Yeah. So Pershing and this American expedition goes down to try to capture Pancho Villa because he'd killed some Americans during this raid on Columbus. They don't find him. They don't get him. Though Patton does see some action down there. He leads an attack where it's a group of 13 Americans, and they're driving in 3 Dodge automobiles, 1915 Dodges.
Oh, yeah. Super new.
Yeah, like super new. This hasn't been done before.
Yeah.
Picture like a Model T Ford, right? It doesn't have like it doesn't have a roof. But 13 American troops in 3 Dodges. They attack a Villista position. They kill 3 of them, including this guy named Julio Cardenas, who was the head of Pancho Villa's bodyguard. And, depending on how you want to look at it, it's possible that this was the first motorized attack in American military history.
Could be. Yeah.
13 guys in a couple cars, but it counts.
Yeah.
Cars were extremely rare in 1915.
Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, World War I is happening.
Yes. And the U.S. does eventually join World War I in April 1917. Remember the Lusitania.
Yeah.
So the U.S. joins World War I in April of 1917, and Blackjack Pershing is chosen to be the overall commander of the American Expeditionary Force, and Patton stays at his side and goes over with him as an aide. Pershing and Patton are getting along pretty well now, and they get stationed in France with the Entente forces. Patton, he doesn't really like being stuck at HQ. He doesn't love doing kind of training new soldiers or doing paperwork. So
no, that doesn't sound like his jam.
It's not his jam at all. He's not a peacetime general. He's not a desk general kind of character.
Yeah, I mean, I bet he had a lot to teach them, But
Yeah, but it wasn't what he wanted to be doing. If there was fighting to be done, he wanted to be out there.
Yeah.
But he doesn't get deployed to it. So what he ends up doing is he starts to take an interest in armored vehicles like tanks. He's a cavalry guy, and cavalry is not viable in 1917. He's trained his entire life. He did the modern pentathlon. He's trained on how to ride a horse and fight with a sword. And neither of these things are going to help you against the belt-fed machine gun. He's got to learn something new. He's got to reorganize. And he's getting into tanks. It's like, maybe this will be the new thing to replace the way cavalry was used in warfare. So he goes to the French Army tank school, and he learns to drive tanks.
Hey.
And he learns how to fight with them, and he learns all of this stuff. So once again, he's being trained by French Army guys. He does learn to speak French fluently, which is kind of cool, and not something else you wouldn't expect out of George Patton. So he gets promoted to colonel, and then he starts training American tank soldiers how to, in the tactics and how to operate the vehicles. And he leads the first American tank attack. Sometimes he drives them. Sometimes he walks next to them. Sometimes he sits on them. But he leads, the tanks at this time, they go like 6 miles an hour. So you could literally walk next to it.
Okay, yeah. Some people might even be able to outrun them.
Yes. Yeah, they're big and slow. But, at the time...
But they're tanks.
Yeah, they're tanks. It's a giant,
behemoth
boat on land. It's an ironclad, right? We hadn't seen cars in 1915.
Yeah.
And then in 1917, you got a tank. And, we look at them now and we're like, it's not that impressive compared to, the stuff that we see today. But... 1917, 1915, man, you never seen anything like it. You're still sailing around in wood boats for the most part, but they did go slow. And so Patton generally is walking in front of them, pointing where the different attacks should go. Oh, shoot that guy, there's a machine gun over there, shoot that. Which is kind of what he becomes known for. He's kind of brave and aggressive, and he's a colonel, so he shouldn't really be out in front of the army like this, but this is Patton's style. He wants to be out in the middle of everything.
It's his style, yeah.
Doesn't want to be sitting at a desk telling people where to go. He wants to be literally pointing to them. So he fights through the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, and during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which we've covered before.
Oh, yeah, that's where our pigeon friend Cher Ami did his or her thing.
Yes. So we're in the Meuse-Argonne, and Patton gets shot in the thigh. And this guy named Joe Angelo, one of his adjutants, drags him into a trench. Patton's passed out he's out for an hour, bleeding, it went clear through his thigh and came out his butt. And this guy revives him, and Patton's kind of laying in his trench, and he just starts giving out orders to this guy, Angelo. He's like, okay, what's happening? Tell me what's going on over here. You go over here and give this order to this guy. Go over here and give this order to this guy. And interestingly, both Patton and Joe Angelo get the Distinguished Service Cross for this battle. It's just below the Medal of Honor on the stack rank of American combat medals.
Yeah.
Patton for leading from the front, getting shot, and then continuing to lead while wounded. And then Joe Angelo for running across a field of machine gun fire to drag him to safety.
Yeah.
And then running across that same field of machine gun fire 2 or 3 more times to, you don't radio in your orders here. You have to run, like the Lost Battalion, you have to run over there and talk to the guy. Hey, you're in charge now because our guy's hurt.
So at some point, World War I ended.
Yes.
Then what did Patton do? Yeah.
Yeah. So World War I ends and Patton goes back home, and he's doing more of that peacetime stuff.
How'd that go with him?
He hates it. Of course he hates it.
Okay. Yeah.
He's doing training and peacetime stuff. There's a couple interesting stories from this time period. He gets a life-saving medal from the Coast Guard because he was out on his boat and some kids fell off either his boat or a nearby boat. And modern pentathlon comes back again. He jumped in the water and swam over and saved a couple of these children that had fallen into the water and were drowning. And the Coast Guard gave him a medal for saving these kids, which is pretty cool.
Cool. Yeah.
One thing that is not that cool is he was part of the Army response to the bonus Army situation in 1932. I'll go over this very briefly, but basically a lot of these World War I vets came home and they weren't getting their pensions, and the government owed them money because they for just back pay and pensions and some bonuses and that stuff.
Yeah.
And in 1932, we're in the Great Depression. Also, the war has been over for, 20 years almost.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a lot of back pay.
A lot of back pay. And, they kind of had deferred it at the time. Oh, you'll get paid. And the deal was they were going to get paid in, I don't know, 39 or something. But in 32, these people are all suffering. They're unemployed. They can't find work. They can't pay their bills. So these old veterans, they set up a camp outside the Capitol, and they demand to be paid now. And George Patton is a colonel at this time, and they order him to go and clear these protesters out. And he says no. And so then they put Douglas MacArthur in charge, other famous, super aggressive American general Douglas MacArthur. They put him in charge, and he orders Patton to clear these guys out. And I think just as like a little bit of a power play, but that's what happened. And Patton argued with them and said he didn't want to do it, and he didn't really feel comfortable doing this, and he didn't think it was right. But they're going to remove him from his position if he doesn't do this. So he does it. He tear gasses these people, and he marches through the army in there and disperses this bonus army group. And amid the tear gas and the, nobody died, but this is also like not, this is kind of rough. But
tear gas.
Yeah.
It's tear gas.
Amid the tear gas and the dispersing and the struggling on the Capitol lawn, George Patton sees Joe Angelo. He's one of the protesters on the field.
Joe Angelo, who helped him out when he was lying bleeding in a trench.
Yes.
Oh, man.
Yeah, Angelo finds him and is like, what? And Patton's like, you got to go. No, you can't. They can't see us like this. Their media's going to have a field day with this if they see us. You got to go. And so he did. But that was a really hard moment for Patton. To kind of have to do that and then see his old friend, like the guy who saved his life, and have to do this. So that's a hard moment for him. After that, he gets sent in 1937 to Hawaii to be an intelligence officer there, kind of working on building plans for the Pacific, which is interesting because he doesn't end up serving in the Pacific. He does, however, write a document in 1937 just titled Surprise that predicts a Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and he predicts it happening in roughly the way that it happened. So that was interesting. It's very like, I was reading through it today. He's very specific. Like, they're going to come up here. They're going to hide their things here because we don't have any guys here. They're going to hide their things here. They're going to use submarines. They're going to use this. And he predicts basically Pearl Harbor 4 years before it happens.
So, did anyone actually read that white paper?
Don't know. I mean,
well, anyway,
had little effect, but he did see it coming, which means he was a good intelligence officer, I suppose. He also gets kicked by a horse and breaks his leg and almost dies because his wound gets infected. Modern pentathlon coming back again. He becomes an advocate for armored warfare, and that's what he decides he's going to spend his time and energy on. So he gets together with a guy named Adna Chaffee, and they start organizing and training and writing the doctrine paperwork for American armor. They end up creating the first and second U.S. Armored Divisions, which are kind of the first two tank divisions in the U.S. Army. And he commands the second, and he nicknames it Hell on Wheels, which I like.
That's awesome. Hell on Wheels.
Hell on Wheels. So, surprise, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor and bring America into the war a couple years later. And George Patton gets sent off to fight in the war. And as he's kind of organizing his men, that's when he gives the famous speech that we know from the movie. One thing I like about it is, one of the complaints about the Americans is that, it took us so long to join the war, and it's because Americans can't fight and they don't want to. The Germans referred to Americans as bubblegum soldiers because they were always chewing bubblegum. They were weak like bubblegum. And if you killed them, you could find bubblegum on them. They were always carrying it. But that's not how Patton saw it. Patton gave his speech, and there's one that I like, and I will once again attempt to quote Patton here. "You are here today for 3 reasons. First, you are here to defend your homes and your loved ones. Second, you are here for your own self-respect because you would not want to be anywhere else. Third, you are here because you are real men, and all real men like to fight." And that kind of sums up Patton in general. This is kind of how he feels about things. He wants to fight. He doesn't want to be sitting at a desk.
Yep.
And so after this break, we're going to get into George Patton in World War II, which is the thing that he's the most known for. Welcome back. So We are with George Patton, famous American Olympian George Patton, and World War I fighter and Pancho Villa fighter, and guy who is looking for a war, and he has finally found the war that he's been looking for his whole life. He goes off to World War II in 1942. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor is December of 41. And in 42, Patton and General Eisenhower, they start to plan what's going to be known as Operation Torch, which is the American attack in North Africa. The World War II is happening all over the world, and the first place that U.S. decides to intervene is in North Africa, where the British are fighting the Germans and the Italians and the Vichy French. So Patton leads a unit. He's got his tank guys that he's been training at 2nd Division. He leads an attack to capture Casablanca from the Vichy French. And yeah, if you've seen Casablanca, you know that it was taken over by the Vichy French, and thanks to the brave actions of Humphrey Bogart and his allies, the way was paved for George S. Patton to land there in 1942 and retake the town. So the Americans capture Casablanca from the Vichy French, and Patton actually, he's commanding from the front as he does, and he earns a Medal of Bravery from the Sultan of Morocco, which is pretty fancy. Pretty badass. Yeah. And he wants to keep pushing east on attack, but he doesn't get selected to lead that attack. Instead, it goes to a different general, and the American army starts to drive east across Morocco and into Tunisia, where they run into the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, yeah. So he is on the German side, obviously on the Axis side. He's a badass in his own right. He's also a very complicated figure. He was a career military officer, renowned for his strategic mind, and wrote a book called Infanterie greift an, or Infantry Attacks, published in 1937, which meant that the book was out and available to be read by all sorts of people. You magnificent bastard. Yes. And he was really smart, kind of a nerd. He learned all about internal combustion engines. He memorized logarithm tables in his spare time, which personally I think is badass. And both of these things are actually probably very useful in his line of work. He got the nickname Desert Fox because, well, he was smart and clever and good at tank warfare in North Africa, because of course anytime someone calls you a fox, the first thing you think of is tank warfare, right? Yes. Of course we say, tanky like a fox. So we could go into a whole lot about Rommel, but this is an episode about Patton. And on the one hand, he had a reputation for being one of the good ones. So he was described as being professional, humane, treated prisoners of war well. When he had some Italian prisoners of war, he said, we should treat them as well as we would treat German civilians. The more you dig into Rommel, the harder it gets to sift out what he actually thought, what people attributed to him, and whatever. And so I do want to make it clear that he is, on the one hand, very cool, and on the other hand, also problematic. And let's not lose sight of the fact that whatever his beliefs and whatever his, code of honor, he's still working for the Nazi regime one way or another. And we do have evidence that he said racist things about soldiers of color, about Indian soldiers in the British Army. On the third hand, he did participate in a conspiracy to kill Hitler. That's right. He was implicated in the Valkyrie operation, the bomb to kill Hitler. And then I think so. And when he was caught, he was given the option of either standing and facing trial and having his name dragged through the mud, having his family disgraced, or, because of the respect that Hitler did have for him, he was given the option of discreetly committing suicide and preserving the name and reputation of his family. And, which is what he did. Yeah, that seems like an easy decision. The Roman, like the fall on your sword. So Rommel is, he is, I believe, rightly believed to be one of the greatest tank commanders of all time, right?
Yeah. No one's criticizing his tank strategy.
Yeah. He helped develop the Blitzkrieg with Heinz Guderian that was able to overrun France in, I think, like 2 weeks. He commanded the lead elements of that Blitzkrieg attack during the Battle of France. And then now he's in North Africa, and he's been beating up on the British down there. And the U.S. joins the war, and in February 1943, they go to attack Rommel at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and Rommel just crushes them. Right. And he's not operating. He doesn't have a lot of reinforcements. He's outnumbered a lot of times. Like, he's not dealing with, as you know, some of his equipment is a little bit older, and he's kind of the B team. Right. Germany didn't have that many resources to go around, and they're kind of prioritizing holding France and maybe invading England and fighting the Russians. And so he's kind of getting whatever's left over, and he's able to beat the U.S. and the British with it. And so, you know, the U.S. gets beat badly at Kasserine Pass, and Patton gets angry, and he's like, give me the opportunity to lead this attack. So Eisenhower says, okay, fine, you can take over, and he gets the call to go forward. And he starts driving ahead, but one of the problems he's running into is that the British Air Force, the RAF, was supposed to kind of provide some close air support, like attack, you know, some German armor from the air, and
get them off their backs.
Right. Yeah. It just makes everything easier when you're not when enemy artillery is moving around. Air support is extremely valuable to war.
Yes.
And Patton, for whatever reason, didn't believe he was getting enough of it. And so it's slowing him down on his advance. So he ends up coming into conflict with Air Vice Marshal Sir Arthur Cunningham of the RAF. And he's like, you know, I need this air support, whatever. And Cunningham dispatches a couple of officers to Patton to talk to him and just be like, hey, look, man, like, we're doing the best we can. You're getting all the air support you need. We have air superiority in the entire region. And as they're having that meeting, the building that they're in gets attacked by German bombers. And like, German bombers are like strafing the airfield, and like literally like pieces of the ceiling are falling down. And Patton...
Womp womp.
Yeah. In the movie, George C. Scott runs outside and starts shooting his firearm at the airplanes and stuff. That didn't really happen, but
no, it seems kind of a foolish waste of
general,
whatever. Yeah.
But he did later remark that, like, because of the irony of the situation, like, I need air support, you have air superiority, and then they get bombed. Patton later remarked, like, if I could find the sons of bitches who were flying those German airplanes, I'd mail each of them a medal. Because he got the air support he needed after that meeting.
Yeah, okay, well.
I could have kissed you guys for proving my point for me.
As if on cue.
Yes.
The ceiling falls down.
Could not have planned this better.
Yeah.
Well, the U.S. operations in North Africa, they're going to continue, but they're going to continue without Patton because we're moving on. Like, we're going to go attack Sicily now, and they want him for that. So he gets redeployed. He comes back out of North Africa. The U.S. and British eventually move on. They will defeat Rommel and drive him out of North Africa, but George Patton is not part of that. He gets redeployed to the U.S. 7th Army, and they are going to attack Sicily to try to knock Italy out of the war. We're going to start marching towards Rome now in 43, and we need to kind of weaken that ally of Germany. Patton gets deployed into Sicily, and he's fighting there, and he's having a lot of success. He's marching his troops around, and he's taking cities from the Italians and the Germans who are defending them. But there's some controversy that happens with him in this operation. He disobeys orders. People tell him not to move forward, and he moves forward because he, of course, is just going to look for a fight, and he finds it wherever he's looking for it. He also finds it with his superior officers who are mad at him for not following orders, and he's angry with them. And he's a hot-headed guy. He's opinionated, and he doesn't say he's sorry for stuff, and he's aggressive. The qualities that you want in a military commander who's on the attack, but
might not work in other contexts.
Right. You're not wrong. You're just an asshole. Like that Big Lebowski quote, right? Like there's some of that happening here too.
Yeah.
And he gets into big trouble around the same time. And this is also in the movie, which I like that they portrayed in the movie. But he also is kind of like, getting mad at soldiers who are suffering from what they called at the time battle fatigue.
Which is what we would call PTSD.
Yes. Yeah. Like same thing we were talking about with tank shock, right? Like this you're seeing some messed up stuff. You're being put in these crazy conditions. You're not sleeping well. Like you're seeing horrible things. You're afraid for your life every minute, every day. But he gets mad at a couple of these guys in hospital for this, and he slaps them. Which is
not cool, Patton.
It's really not cool. Yeah. He told some of his guys he told some of his hospital officers, like, if they're coming in with battle fatigue, I don't want to hear about it. Right. Don't even treat them for that. They're just cowards, and you got to send them back out there, which it's not cool. That's not a cool way of treating people who are suffering from this. And Patton is just kind of like a grumpy grandpa. And like, even by greatest generation standards, he's he's like a grumpy uncle or something. And he's also like, to this day, he's a hero of grumpy uncles everywhere. Just kind of his vibe. And again, it's what maybe made him a very aggressive military commander. But interestingly, like, this doesn't play in 1943 either. So when word of this comes out, he gets removed from command. He was pretty successful in Sicily, but when word starts coming out that like he's fighting with his own people over their battle fatigue, Eisenhower considered removing him, like sending him back stateside, but instead they take the command away from him, and he won't command another force in the field for almost a year. So the U.S. Army, they start to use this to their advantage, because over the fighting that has happened in North Africa and in Sicily so far, he's been successful. And the Germans, they don't like him because he's very aggressive and he attacks hard, and his men fight hard for him. You know, these two incidents with the PTSD guys, I mean, sure, he had plenty of, people would grumble about him, right? His nickname in the army was Old Blood and Guts, and the joke among his men was like, yeah, our blood, his guts. But that wasn't entirely like, a lot of his men liked him, and a lot of them responded really well. He would give these big bombastic speeches, and people liked it, and they liked that he was going to lead them. And, even if they didn't like him personally, they thought he was their best chance to get home alive, because he was going to fight and win.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, and not screw around with them. He was going to take them into battle. He gave speeches like, here's one that just kind of encompasses George Patton, where he's like, I don't want any messages saying I'm holding my position. We're not holding a goddamn thing. Let the Germans do that. We are advancing constantly, and we're not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy's balls. We're going to twist his balls and kick the living shit out of him all the time. Our basic plan of operation is to advance and keep on advancing, regardless of whether we have to go over, under, or through the enemy. That's how he operated. And that's how he talked. And sometimes, and that worked for a lot of his soldiers, and a lot of his men really liked him and were really proud to have served with him. Yeah,
there's a sort of clarity to his message.
Yes, that's what he wants to do, and that's what he's going to do. And you can't send that guy home, because that guy is inspirational to your men, and he's terrifying to your enemy, because he's developing this reputation.
He's got his uses.
Right. The Germans are like, I don't want anybody twisting my balls. Well, no, so what they do is that they haven't put him in charge of guys. They think maybe, and there's some talk that like maybe Patton himself was starting to like suffer a little bit of PTSD stuff, and that's why he was hitting these guys and acting the way that he was, because maybe he was starting to kind of the pressure of the war and stuff was starting to get to him. I don't know how true any of that is, but and if it was true, he wouldn't have ever said that. So or want that said about him, probably. Anyway, what the U.S. Army is able to do with this, though, is use him as a threat. So the army, Sicily is happening. The Americans start moving into Italy. But what the Allies are trying to do is attack Normandy. That's your big D-Day operation. And the only way D-Day works is if the entire German army doesn't know exactly where we're going to land, right? You had to distract them and make them think something else was going to happen. So what they do with Patton, they put him in Dover, which is where you would amass your forces if you were going to have a big landing at Calais, which is northeast France. We were actually planning on landing northwest France, but we were trying to trick the Germans into thinking we were going to land in the northeast at Calais, which is a little closer to England than Normandy is. And there's a whole thing about, we could do a whole episode about like all of the misdirection around trying to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
We had spies, like the SOEs working over there. England had this huge network of double agents that were trying to convince the Germans that the landing was going to come at Calais. There were inflatable tanks that were being set up outside Dover.
Inflatable tanks?
Yes. Yeah, like you'd see in a car dealership, like just blown up inflatable Sherman tanks, so that if a German aircraft flew over, they'd see that there were tanks lined up there when there really weren't.
So decoy tanks.
And all the tanks in the other location were covered under tarps and camouflage netting.
Yeah.
But the other ones were kind of sitting out in the open, or weren't camouflaged quite as well.
So, and apparently that worked because the Normandy landing was successful.
Normandy landing was successful.
Yeah.
This huge operation to distract the Germans worked. And Patton, even though he did very little on the battlefield or in anything other than psychological, like the idea of him being in Dover, contributed a little bit to the Germans being concerned that this has to be where they're going to line up. They can't have this attack without this guy. So the attack happens, June 1944. We've all seen the Saving Private Ryan stuff, and like the Allies attack, and they get a foothold in Normandy. And Patton's Third Army is deployed. He's put back in charge of the Third Army. They deploy him on the west flank of the invasion, so like Brittany region. And most of the Germans have once the landings are successful, they start to pull back towards Germany. And Patton is operating in Western France. So he doesn't encounter huge resistance. Some Vichy French guys, some Germans, but he's making really big gains really quickly. He's not waiting for orders to slow down and stop. As long as he's got fuel in his tanks, he's going to drive them. And he drives them basically until he gets to the border with Germany. He sweeps them all the way around France. Paris is liberated. He wasn't part of that operation, but he drives down those highways, and he gets to Metz, which is on the border with Germany, and he runs out of gas.
Oh!
And so he's kind of stuck there, and they're not giving him more gas because they know if they give him gas, he's just going to keep driving forward.
They cut him off, or it's sort of.
Yeah, cut him off. Like, you've had enough, right?
Yeah.
He's not gonna slow down. He's not gonna stop. As long as he can put fuel into his tanks, he's gonna drive them forward. And maybe we're gonna wait to maybe we'll wait, see what happens first. Wait for the rest of the army to catch up.
Yeah. He
has some great quote about like, all these idiots want to worry about their flanks. I don't care about my flanks. That's for the enemy to worry about. I just want to go forward. So he does some fighting around Metz. Metz is a fortress, and there's kind of a grind there. He's ground to a halt. He doesn't have fuel. He's trying to attack Metz. The Germans are defending it pretty hard. And that's roughly where he's at in December of 1944. So he's been in North Africa, he's been in Italy, he's been in Normandy, but these aren't the actions in World War II that he's really the best known for. He is known for what happens in December of 1944 at what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. So the Allies have attacked Germany. They've pushed all the way through France. They're on the German border. They've just got to cross the river to get into Germany now. And the Germans make a counterattack. They kind of throw all their best forces together, all of their SS panzer divisions and all their best troops, and they decide they're going to try to break out. So in December of 1944, under bad weather conditions that don't allow the Allied aircraft access, 29 German divisions move through Belgium. 29 divisions. A division's like 20,000 people. And they're doing the Blitzkrieg all over again. They're going to do the Battle of France plan all over again and just roll up the Allies like they did in 1940. So they start rolling out, and the Allies, they do what they can, but it's winter, it's cold, all the roads are blocked, there's no air cover, and the Germans are kind of rolling through it early on. They're kind of steamrolling the troops there. It was a weak spot in the Allied lines, and the Germans were exploiting it. And they do a really effective job of driving through, but the Americans hold out at one city in Belgium. It's called Bastogne. And if you've seen Band of Brothers, this is the winter battles that they fight. It's the 101st Airborne Division. And these are airborne troops. They're not designed to fight tanks. They're not designed to fight panzers and Tiger tanks and Panther tanks and that sort of thing. The anti-armored weapons they have are human carried, not or can be deployed by airplane. They're not the big guns that you need to fight this sort of thing.
Yeah.
So they're holding out at Bastogne, and the Germans have to get them out of there because Bastogne is like a hub for the main road that goes from Germany to Antwerp, which is where they want to get to complete this encirclement. And, the 101st Airborne isn't giving it up. They're holding, but it's one division of guys who have no real heavy weapons, and they're outnumbered and they're in big trouble, and they're not designed to hold out. Like, airborne troops aren't designed to defend positions. They're designed to attack behind enemy lines, weakly defended areas.
Yeah.
So we got to get there. We got to get these guys some reinforcements or bad things could happen. Patton has started to hear about this, and the second he starts hearing about this, he starts making plans.
Of course he does.
Yeah, he's got 7 contingency plans on how, if you just give me some gas, I can get out there.
Yeah.
So Eisenhower holds a meeting of the generals. Like, what are we going to do? These guys in Bastogne, they're fighting, they're struggling, they're getting hammered by the Germans. We got to go help them. Patton says he can disengage 6 divisions of the Third Army and have them engage with the Germans in 3 days. And Eisenhower says, no way.
Yeah. Now, these are tanks we're talking about, and divisions, combat divisions. If you look at Google Maps, they'll tell you that getting from Saarbrücken to Bastogne is 2 hours along a major highway, but that's if you're driving probably above the speed limit in just a little car and you're not trying to schlep all this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Your Volkswagen Jetta could do it in 2 hours, but we're driving 133,000 vehicles carrying 68,000 tons of gear.
Yes.
And, you've seen those pictures of the Russian column that was headed for Kyiv. It's that kind of thing, right? Like, it's just it's a highway of tanks driving in a single file or double file this distance in the snow, not on a highway. And we've established that these tanks aren't that fast. I mean, these are better versions of the tanks than the Renault FTs that they were driving in World War I. But
still, they're just tanks.
A Sherman tank is not a Volkswagen Jetta in terms of speed. And but he's kind of got the plan. And the second Eisenhower, he's able to convince Eisenhower that he can do it. Eisenhower's not sure about it, but he's like, okay, fine, see what you can do. So Patton is able to move these guys there in 48 hours. The attack is spearheaded by the 37th Tank Battalion, which is led by Colonel Creighton Abrams, who's the guy that the M1 Abrams tank, our current U.S. military tank, it's named after him. And they get across there. They rush across Germany to relieve the fighting at Bastogne. And these German divisions have run up against the 101st Airborne, and they're being pinned down. And then the counterattack arrives, and it's just, divisions of U.S. tanks driving as fast as they can. And they are able to break up this German attack and defeat the Battle of the Bulge. Now, historians like to argue about how successful, how important the Battle of the Bulge was, and how much of a chance the Germans had to actually inflict a severe defeat on the Allies if this battle hadn't happened. But I always hate the alternate history, thinking about that kind of stuff. Yeah,
because you can come up with all sorts of whatever.
Yeah, being able to move that amount of troops and armor and vehicles and trucks. So you need all these trucks and jeeps and all these other things to carry the fuel and the ammo and all that stuff. Being able to move that logistically is a humongous feat. And they were able to get out there and they were able to defeat these German and the best army that the Germans had, right? The best troops they could throw out there. This is all, first SS, second SS, big units. And the Americans are able to get out there, and Patton's able to get out there and defeat them, which is a huge turning point in the war.
Yeah.
And from this point on, we get across the Rhine River, we're in Germany. The main thrust of the German army, the main attacking forces of them have been defeated. Their big defensive line, the Siegfried Line, is breached. And from that point on, Patton just rushes into Germany, and his only problems that he's having are gas related.
And gas related, just to make clear, we do not mean flatulence, we mean fuel.
Yes. Yeah. So they're not, like I said, they're not giving him the fuel that he needs, like the gasoline that he needs. And so he has his guys, they reach one fuel depot and he has his guys lie and say they're from the First Army instead of the Third Army. So they steal the First Army's gas and keep driving. And so, so they steal their gas and they drive across Germany and Czech, and the war ends, and he's in Czechoslovakia when the war ends. Him and the Third Army are credited with capturing 81,500 miles of enemy territory over 280 days of continuous combat.
Wow, that's 9 months, over 9 months of continuous combat.
Yeah, every day. And like some of those spearhead units, Creighton Abrams, the 761st Tank Battalion was involved with a lot of this. They were in a lot of the fighting. They were the first African-American armored unit. And they were at the front of a lot of the fighting here. And they did heroes work trying to fight the Germans here. Yeah. A couple of guys from that unit received medals of honor. And it's a really interesting story as well. And that was part of the Patton's Third Army. Okay, so the war ends, and now we have George Patton with no more wars to fight. World War II's over. Allies won, and then the Japanese surrender. Patton is just like, there's a quote of him where he's just like, let's just fight the Russians while the bayonets are still sharp. We've got our whole army over here. Let's just start fighting the Russians. Yeah. And all of the rest of the allies are just kind of like, meh, we're friends with them, remember? Yeah. We're not going to do that right now. Stalin seems like a nice guy. We're going to, or at very least, we don't want to keep fighting these guys. They've got their whole army out here mobilized as well. So let's take a pause on fighting wars and try to rebuild Germany here. Mm-hmm. And he writes in his diary after he hears about the Japanese surrender, he writes, "Yet another war has come to an end, and with it my usefulness to the world." So he goes around giving speeches. He's a huge celebrity in the U.S. now. He's like, considered, him and Eisenhower, like the greatest, most well-known, and Omar Bradley, like some of the greatest American generals of the war, the most well-known fighters in Europe. And he does these speeches. He hates it. And he starts acting like an angry grandpa, and maybe it's some PTSD stuff. Maybe it's CTE from like the shelling, and maybe he's just drinking too much. Maybe he just was bored and angry. I don't know, but he really doesn't like rebuilding Germany. He doesn't like, kind of maintaining the peace. He starts saying some anti-Semitic stuff. He starts saying some racist stuff. He wants to fight the Russians. We got to do something with this guy. Okay, so he's removed from the Third Army, and they give him this little staff position, which he doesn't like. Because he's a history guy and he loves the history stuff, they were going to put him in charge of writing the history of the war for the U.S. Army. So they put him in a position where he could do that. Yeah. But he hates it. No. It's not working for him. And then on December 9th, 1945, so 7 months after Victory in Europe Day, he's driving from a pheasant hunting trip in the Rhineland. He's driving in a military Jeep. He's not driving it. His aide-de-camp is driving it, a guy who's been friends with him for a long time. And they're driving, and they have a low-speed head-on collision with a U.S. Army truck. Nobody's hurt. Neither driver is hurt, but Patton ends up hitting the windshield with his head and breaks his neck. And he's paralyzed from the neck down. He goes to the hospital. His wife flies out to spend time with him. He's in traction for 12 days, and then he dies on the 21st of December at the age of 60. And I think this is weird, but he's buried in Luxembourg, of all places.
Well, is there a U.S. Army cemetery there?
Yeah, there's an Army cemetery. It's kind of near where he was when he died, but you still would, you'd think Arlington National Cemetery or something. You wouldn't expect it. If you wanted to see Patton's grave, you'd have to go to Luxembourg. Yeah. Anyway, he's a complicated character. He is, and definitely badass. Definitely badass. I mean, that's hard to argue with. And anytime you talk to anytime you want to have a discussion of great badasses from American history, he's kind of the World War II general that you bring up, because he he was very successful on the battlefield, but he also had this like bombastic personality. It got him in trouble sometimes. And there's certainly problematic aspects of his character, but he also, was that's the kind of guy you want on your team when you're in a war, right? He was big and loud and aggressive, and had these huge speeches where he was going to rip the enemy's guts out and grease his tank treads with them. And that plays well sometimes. Yeah. And he's correctly remembered as being one of the first armored commanders in U.S. history. And he's also remembered as being one of the greatest. Him and Rommel kind of get listed as the greatest tank commanders whenever you start talking about that kind of thing. The Americans named 3 tanks after him. The M46, the M48, and the M60 tanks were all the Patton. They're variations on a similar theme, but they are still 3 different tanks named after him.
Yeah, seems like a fitting tribute.
And I guess what I want to end this on is a quote from Patton himself. He's got some problems, and there's some stuff that, people can criticize about him. But the way I want to end this is with a quote from him to his men. He says, "There's one great thing that you men will be able to say after this war is over and once you are home again. You may be thankful that in 20 years from now, when you are sitting by the fireplace with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you what you did in the Great World War II, you won't have to cough, shift him to the other knee and say, well, your granddaddy shoveled shit in Louisiana. No, sir. You can look him straight in the eye and say, son, your granddaddy rode with the Great Third Army and a son of a goddamn bitch named Georgie Patton."
Yeah.
Which I think is how he wants to be remembered, and I think it's how he is remembered.
I think so, yes. Yeah. So that's George Patton.
That's George Patton.
Yeah.
And, all right, well, Pat?
Stay badass. Stay badass. And yeah, it's been fun hanging out with you. And hey, listeners, like, subscribe, tell your friends.
Yeah, definitely do that. And thanks so much for listening. We will see you on the next one.
Badass of the Week is an iHeartRadio podcast produced by High Five Content. Executive producers are Andrew Jacobs, me, Pat Larish, and my co-host, Ben Thompson. Writing is by me and Ben. Story editing is by Ian Jacobs, Brandon Phibbs. Mixing and music and sound design is by Jude Brewer. Special thanks to Noel Brown at iHeart. Badass of the Week is based on the website badassoftheweek.com, where you can read all sorts of stories about other badasses. If you want to reach out with questions, ideas, you can email us at badasspodcast@badassoftheweek.com. If you like the podcast, subscribe, follow, listen, and tell your friends and your enemies if you want, as we'll be back next week with another one. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.